So here we are, we're at the Petersburg National Battlefield Park, and we've been talking about some of the initial assaults at Petersburg. A lot of what we've discussed involved the initial assaults on June 15th, 1864. Maybe we talked a little bit about what's going on June 17th, 1864, but now we're moving on to another day, the 18th of June, 1864, and you know, in a way, might mark the end. We'll see if Will agrees on that, the end of the sort of the first offensive, the initial attacks on Petersburg. We'll see about that, but what we're going to talk about here, and we got Doug Allman behind the camera, and I'll turn it over to Will Green in a second, is just one of the sad affairs. This happens in war. There's a lot of sad affairs at war. But as far as the initial attacks, this one's always seemed particularly costly and sad to me. So let's start that with Will Green.
Thanks, Gary. We're standing along the original roadbed of the Prince George Courthouse Road that connected the county seat of Prince George County with the city of Petersburg. Behind me, or in front of me and behind the camera, is an embankment that still survives of the roadbed, and this embankment would provide some cover for the regiment that would be involved in the assault that we're going to talk about here. Now, as Gary pointed out, this is the day 4 of Grant's initial attempt to capture Petersburg. He succeeds in capturing 2 miles of the Confederate line on June 15th. The Confederates fall back to a second line. That line is attacked on June 16th and 17th, rendering that line incapable of being defended. And the Confederates fall back to a third line. And that third line is sometimes referred to as, well, I'll skip that part of it because we're starting to get into too much detail there. The third Confederate line is going to be where we're going to finish up our walk here today. Now, General Meade understands that the clock is running out on him. In other words, he realizes that sooner or later, the Army of Northern Virginia is going to be heading down to Petersburg, and the window of opportunity of attacking the Confederates when they are grossly outnumbered is quickly ending. So at about 4 o'clock in the morning on June the 18th, he orders his corps, his various corps, the 5th Corps, the 2nd Corps, and the 9th Corps, and one division of the 6th Corps. There's about 80,000 federal troops located south of the Appomattox River on that morning to advance and attack the 2nd Confederate line. And as they go forward, they realize, hey, this line has been abandoned. Where are the Confederates? And they look several hundred, 800 to 1,000 yards ahead of them, and they see the raw earth of a new Confederate line called the Harris Line, named after David B. Harris, who was General Beauregard's chief engineer who laid out that line. Meade orders the troops to go forward that morning, but they really don't make a serious advance at all. One of the quotes that I think illustrates this is referring to 2 brigades of John Gibbon's division. And this officer says, "The officers jumped up, we waved our swords and gave the order to charge. But our men did not stir. The more I saw they were going to refuse to go, the more urgent I became. The men knew that what they could and could not do. They had decided that they could not take this line. They had experience. The whole brigade acted the same way. Not a man started." Meade would repeat his orders to attack late in the morning on June the 18th, and a similar situation occurred. Now, these federal soldiers were not cowards. The officers were not cowards. There was complaints about an inability to coordinate these attacks, to support one another. And the federal soldiers, frankly, by June 18th, were getting a little tired of attacking fixed Confederate positions. By 2:30 in the afternoon, Meade was furious. He was so frustrated that he punched the button on his military machine and nothing would happen. So he sent an order to the acting commander of the 2nd Corps, David B. Birney. And that order said, "I have sent a positive order to General Burnside and Warren to attack at all hazards with their whole force. I find it useless to appoint an hour to effect cooperation, and I am therefore compelled to give you the same order. You have a large corps, powerful and numerous, and I beg you will at once, as soon as possible, assault in a strong column. The day is fast going, and I wish the practicability of carrying the enemy's line settled before dark. Well, General Birney turns to a couple of his division commanders, Francis Barlow and John Gibbon, and he orders them to deploy for an assault. And one of Barlow's regiments was the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. And I think many of us understand that these heavy artillery units had been stationed in the Washington defenses for a couple of years, where they had seen nothing more dangerous than a dress parade. But when the casualties began accumulating in Grant's overland campaign, he called these heavy artillery units down to the Army of the Potomac, gave them rifles, and told them they're now in the infantry. Now, the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery had taken terrible casualties at the Battle of Spotsylvania. They were not rookie soldiers, yet their regiment was as large as many of the brigades. They still had some 950 men in their regiment. And they came down this road, and they deployed behind this embankment in 3 different lines. And their officer gave them, their commanding officer gave them the orders for this attack. The first line, he divided, his name was Daniel Chapin. He divided the regiment into 3 battalions. The 1st battalion was to go forward and clear out all of the obstructions so that there was an open path to the Confederate fort, which was just several hundred yards up this hill in front of us. The 2nd battalion would follow the 1st and fire to suppress the Confederate resistance. And the 3rd battalion then would charge across and into the Confederate fort. Now, if you read about the attacks of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, you will often read accounts that say these were naive soldiers who had no combat experience and therefore had no idea what they were getting into, which is poppycock. These guys knew exactly what they were getting into, and there's plenty of quotes that substantiate that. Nevertheless, they agreed to go forward. The bravery that it would take to make this assault would be tremendous. Now, there were 2 regiments behind the 1st Maine, and then there were 2 brigades behind them that were supposed to follow up the 1st Maine's success. And over on Hares Hill, over to my right, there were 2 brigades of Gibbon's division that were poised to make an assault from their position against the Confederate high ground here that became known as Colquitt's Salient. Colquitt Salient was simply a fortified position. A salient, as we all know, was a projection in the line. It was a very important projection because it sort of separated the 2nd Corps from the 9th Corps so that they really couldn't cooperate together. And it was manned by a couple of regiments of Georgians from Alfred Colquitt's brigade, along with some Alabamans from Archibald Gracie's brigade. We're only talking about 3 or 4 regiments are up here. And there were 7 Union brigades poised to make the attack. But it would be the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery that would lead the assault. And what we can do is walk in the footsteps of these brave 950 men from Maine. Actually, it wasn't 950, it was about 900 because 50 lucky guys were responsible for watching the knapsacks that the other soldiers had taken off. So those were the fellows that drew the best straw that day as they walk up. Now, as we do this walk, you have to bear in mind there were no trees. This was a cornfield that belonged to the Hare family. So the ground cover has changed significantly, but when we get through this non-historic woods, we'll break out into the open field, and you'll see exactly what the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery saw.
And as we're making our walk, as Will mentioned, these are not green soldiers. If you think about the summer of 1862 is when Lincoln's going to issue his second call for volunteers. That's when regiments like the 20th Maine and the 19th Maine and the 121st New York, some of these regiments that we think of as excellent Union regiments that joined the Army in the summer of 1862, by now are forming the backbone of the Army of the Potomac. That's when the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery joined. They were actually originally the 18th Maine and then redesignated as Heavy Artillery before being sent to Washington, and then ultimately joining Grant during the Overland Campaign. Some of these men have served in other regiments prior to joining the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, and as Will mentioned, they saw combat at Spotsylvania Courthouse. So when we think of these heavy artillery regiment, the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, they were not seeing combat for the first time, like Will mentioned, and they've been in the Army for as long as Joshua Chamberlain. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about the heavy artillery. Heavy artillery had seen heavy action at Cold Harbor, specifically the 7th and the 8th New York Heavy Artillery, the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, and then those same regiments are going to see action on the 16th and 17th here at Petersburg. So by the time it rolls around, the 1st Maine has sort of had a respite compared to the other heavy artillery regiments that have been involved since Cold Harbor, and they're making this attack their second taste of combat, but they are itching to prove that they are every bit as good soldiers as the other men in their brigade. What I find interesting is that one regiment in that brigade, the 11th New Jersey, recalled that they were, in their regimental history, said they were not asked to participate in this fight. Another thing worth mentioning about the other regiments in that brigade is that some of them are towards the end of their enlistments. The 115th Pennsylvania is about 4 days away from leaving Grant's army. And another regiment is going to end up, the 16th Massachusetts is going to end their term of enlistment in July, and some of the New Jersey regiments in their brigade are going to end their terms of enlistment in October. So these brigades are dwindling, and as Will mentioned, the clock is ticking, not only because Lee's troops are heading to Petersburg, but because Grant's army is going to lose men very quickly.
Well, we're still moving in these 3 lines of troops of about 300 men per line. Now the extension, one of the things that I think people have a hard time understanding on battlefields is getting the scale. We're walking along this trail, and I guess your mind starts to think, well, there were 4 guys on the trail and they're going forward here. This line extended all the way from what is the Park Tour Road now to over here to our right, which is now a subdivision. So this was a line that was about 300 yards in length, with 3 different ranks moving forward. Again, the woods were not here. This was open ground, but we are down in defilade. I hope that the camera can pick up the fact that we are down below the crest of a hill. But we are just about to get out of defilade and into range of and view of the Confederates up in the strong point on the high ground here called Colquitt Salient. And it is no accident that the veterans of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery placed their monument right over here, because this is the point, equal with this line here. Here is the point where the 1st Maine begin to take their casualties. And can the camera pick up the back of an interpretive sign up on top of the hill? If you can see that in that direction right there, that is going to be the nose of Colquitt Salient. And as these 900 Maine boys in 3 long lines of almost 300 yards in length get to this point, this part of the geography, they start taking casualties. And one of the officers said, the field in front of us became a burning, seething, crashing, hissing hell in which human courage, flesh and bone were struggling with an impossibility to either succeed or to return with much hope of life. We were laid out in squads and companies. It beggars description. And within 10 minutes time, 632 of the roughly 900 soldiers who made this attack were shot, killed or wounded in 10 minutes, which represents the largest single loss of any regiment in any Civil War battle in the entire war. This whole field would have been covered with the corpses and writhing wounded of these men of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. Confederate casualties here were unreported. Gracie had 1 or 2 regiments involved in the fighting here. He reported 1 killed and 24 wounded. We don't have any casualties from Colquitt's brigade, but they were very few as well. Not only were the Maine boys getting shot from straight ahead of us, but they were getting fire from their right flank as well. And they were just completely decimated. So this monument is a good landmark. It shows you, and there's one of the many values of monuments. It's here for a reason. And the reason is this is the latitude in which the 1st Maine starts getting this slaughtered. Not a single Maine soldier made it up to the front here. And as I say, in 10 minutes time, and in about less time than we've had on this video, 2/3 of this huge regiment were shot down. Did any of the other Union troops go forward? They didn't. And again, I don't want to assume that, have anybody think that these fellows were cowards. Some of the regiments in support got up, took a few steps forward, and hit the ground. So that they obeyed orders, and then they hit the ground against Confederate fire. They had just seen enough. And although there would be one more Union attack on June 18th in front of the 9th Corps, this was almost the end of the 1st Petersburg Offensive. And although it had captured 2 Confederate lines and had made lots of progress, they did not succeed in capturing Petersburg or eliminating the Army of Northern Virginia. The Army of the Potomac was just not the same army on June 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th that it had been when it crossed the Rapidan River on May 4th. The flower of that army, its officers and its fighting men, were lying in shallow graves or back in hospitals in Orange County and Spotsylvania County and Hanover County, and the army that got here was simply exhausted. They had combat fatigue, and you had regiments like the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery that still had a lot of spunk in them, but when Meade would push the button on his military machine, instead of going into action like it did at Wilderness or Spotsylvania or even Cold Harbor, it just simply made a whirring sound and didn't go anywhere. And so the 1st Petersburg Offensive ends, and the rest of the campaign for Petersburg, the next 288 days, lie in the future.
We're going to make our way over to the monument. And as Will mentioned, 632 men from Maine are going to lay out in this field, writhing in agony, some of them dead, and their names are on this monument here to the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. And one of those names is a man named James Emerson. James Emerson had enlisted in the Army in 1861 as a member of the 3rd Maine, and while on the Virginia Peninsula had suffered severe heat stroke and epileptic seizures that sent him home and got him discharged. And so he's back home in Maine. And then according to a letter in his pension record, his wife repudiates him and refuses to see him or be involved with him whatsoever because he's come home ostensibly. And then he will re-enlist in the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, and then will then find himself here on June 18th, 1864. And he will be in one of those 3 lines. He will be wounded 6 times in the fighting there. His body will be taken off the field. He survives the fighting long enough to get back to a Washington, D.C. hospital, where he will then have a couple of amputations and then ultimately succumb to his wounds on June the 30th. And James Emerson is buried in one of the Civil War sections at Arlington National Cemetery, and his name is here on this monument.
So indeed, battlefield monuments not only talk about the place where something happened, but also serve as memorials for those who fought.
And these are not just names on a bronze plaque. These are real people. Every one of these people, mortally wounded or killed in 10 minutes' time on June 18th in faraway Petersburg, Virginia, a place that those fellows from Maine would have no idea where it was on the map 2 years ago, 3 years ago. All had loved ones who cared about them. They had families, they had futures, they had hopes, and they gave them up for whatever cause that they were fighting for, and the chances are they were fighting to preserve the Union out here and willing to give up their life, knowing full well when they took off those knapsacks and put them on the ground and lined up for this attack that many of them would never come home.
Thank you all for watching and supporting battlefield preservation.